Hey all, welcome back to the neighborhood. It's your friendly neighborhood reviewer coming at you with a super special review on the Moondrop super spaceship. I also covered the OG spaceship on my blog, and there might be a video review eventually. But how does the S.S.R stack up? Let's get into it. So the S.S.R initially ran into some issues. After a strong release and some early positive reviews, production came to a halt due to issues with the cable. Apparently, some units were shipped with cables that negatively influenced the experience and/or the sound. So when Shenzhen Audio offered to send me out an updated model of the S.S.R, I couldn't pass up the opportunity to see if any changes had been made, and took the liberty to obtain a unit from the initial run as well. You see, conspiracists had speculated that Moondrop had been using this opportunity to retune this IEM, as some reviewers had suggested that the S.S.R did not have true reference bass levels, mostly because it didn't stand up to their limited personal library of music. In any case, I was able to listen to both the initial release and the updated S.S.R, and I will tell you that from an auditory perspective, there are absolutely zero differences. Like Moondrop had reported, the only changes to take place consisted of adding colorway options and adjusting the cable. And while the cables between the two versions look mostly identical, the newer cable is less stiff and flows more nicely in use in comparison to the original one. So what do I think of these IEMs overall? Well, I think they're small, built relatively robustly, and produce excellent monitor-like sound for the price point. If that sounds like an IEM that interests you, then stay tuned. The build for $40 is actually quite impressive. They have a small metal housing that is somewhat heart-shaped. The 2-pin connection takes place on top of the non-rounded side of the heart. And when I say small, these things seriously are tiny. Each one is about the circumference of a dime, in fact. Yet, the nozzle for an IEM of this size is fairly long, and it juts off the back of the metal shell somewhat awkwardly. Because of this, and perhaps in spite of its tiny size, one should expect a rather long insertion, and as it turns out, the insertion is actually rather key to the sound, especially with regard to its bass response. But more on that when we get to the sound description. For now, let's talk more about the cable. In addition to behaving mostly well, as I have already stated, the wire is protected for portable carry by a clear plastic sheath. Inside this sheath, the wire is simply braided and appears to be comprised of a silver-coated copper material. As a nice touch, subsequent to the 2-pin connector, there's a single red rubber ring on the right side to denote the difference between right and left. The ear hook is appropriately aggressive for the shape of this IEM, and due to the small weight, miniature size, and general ear clearance, the silicone ear tip itself mostly keeps this IEM suspended in your ear without it really touching any of your surrounding ear tissue. To me, this makes the Moondrop S.S.R one of the most comfortable IEMs to wear, period. While some may not like the depth of the insertion needed for a proper seal here, it is less of an issue for me in this case, especially in comparison to something like an edemotic. Generally speaking, these things sound similar to the OG Moondrop spaceships, however, after burn-in, they are less assaultive at 3K, and have a smoother and more well-distributed bass response. They are also tonally much warmer in comparison, but remain pretty neutral in a vacuum. Most accurately, I would describe the timbre as predominantly neutral with hints of warmth. To put this in perspective, I would say that in comparison to something like the Koss KPH-30i, which also has a relatively neutral presentation with some mild warmth, the S.S.R is significantly less warm and leaning even more towards neutrality. With this in mind, timbre should be seen as a particular strength for the S.S.R, and I cannot think of another set anywhere near the price point that nails timbre as well as the S.S.R does. Perhaps this is why Moondrop has labeled this version of the spaceship as the super reference. And let me tell you, unlike some others have reported, these do have reference levels of bass. In this case, it's just that the bass is not overemphasized or additive to the sound as others might have come to expect in the IEM space. I will also note that one does have to achieve a certain level of insertion depth and seal if they want to accurately observe the proper levels of bass presence in the S.S.R. In general, the bass is articulate, detailed, and well textured, with monitoring levels of sub-bass roll-off. In fact, I observed levels of bass detail with this set which astounded me for the price point. However, this does not mean that the bass will be overly forward in any way on tracks which are not recorded with elevated bass levels. Because of this, some might perceive the bass to be lacking. However, in this case, it will most likely be lacking in the recording itself rather than the earphone being deficient. In other words, the bass is at reference level, even if it may be placed a dB or two back at times for the sake of listenability. For example, on certain classic rock tracks, it may seem like the bass is insufficient, but do keep in mind that classic rock is not really a bass-heavy genre, and as such, the bass really should not generally be over-accentuated. For this set, one should not have unrealistic expectations regarding the bass reproduction for music that is not sound engineered to have low-end focus. Unlike a true reference earphone, the vocals and mid-range presentation in the S.S.R is rather forward and to a certain extent artificially accentuated. In fact, like the OG Moondrop spaceship, the S.S.R also has a rather large 3K peak. But unlike the OG spaceship, the S.S.R's 3K peak bothers me less and calms down a bit after a few days of use. Nevertheless, there is some intensity here, which might come across as aggressive or potentially shouty to some, and it does grate on me on occasion if my ears aren't in the mood for the particular presentation of this set. Regarding tip selection, I really only found the provided stocks or RHA dual density tips to be acceptable. Dual density tips brought up the bass a tad and lessened the forward nature of the mid-range, if those are issues for you that you wish to adjust. Staging is another particular strength of the S.S.R, and it is appropriately wide without any smearing or stretching. It also has a good depth and height to it. In fact, the S.S.R really excels with its stage in mind in comparison to other competing IEMs within its price range. The S.S.R staging is much more accurate, less cluttered, and not as boxed in. In fact, this aspect of the sonic presentation borders on having an expansive quality to it, a characteristic that I have only observed in much more expensive IEMs, such as the Campfire Andromeda, the Final Audio B3, and most recently, the Shozy Rouge. Bear in mind that it will not be quite as expansive as any of those sets in particular, but considering that the S.S.R is only $40, they should nevertheless be considered a phenomenal buy. Like the S.S.R's tonality, the stage is rather flat and vocals are deadlocked in its center, and it has impeccable consistency across its auditory plane from left to right. Instruments have good separation and distinction to them, and they image with both specificity and accuracy within its space. Transients are also extremely excellent and natural in their presentation. Furthermore, peripheral details are accurately placed and very nicely done as well. Uniquely, there is some dimensionality to the sound, with both tonality and staging remaining rather flat and accurate to the recording, despite it favoring some mid-forwardness. Resolution, on the other hand, is just good enough to be considered excellent for its price range. and it is not as resolving as some full-scale dynamic drivers or other multiple balanced armature-driven sets. In fact, it reminds me a lot of the HD600 from the headphone world, not only with regard to its tonality, but also in terms of its overall level of resolution. In other words, the S.S.R isn't the most resolving IEM on the market, or even best in class, but it is plenty resolving nevertheless, and it resolves better than many others beyond its price point. It may not turn your head immediately with regard to this, but it will satisfy you in the long term. Instead of focusing on ultimate resolution here, rich textures and sonic details are more the S.S.R's foray. The treble presentation is, to some degree, unremarkable. I would never call the treble presentation sharp or aggressive, or on the other hand, dull or muted, but like the mid-range, there can be some intensity with specific regard to forwardness here or there, which seems to mostly be track dependent. Nevertheless, there is a roll-off at the top end near 10K. In the end, I would describe the S.S.R's treble presentation as one that mostly stands out of the way, and despite its forwardness, remains rather neutral in its presentation without any addition or subtraction from the sound. If you are a treble head, these might not have enough sparkle for you, as, like I have been saying, the S.S.R are rather flat, especially in this domain. Initially, I preferred to EQ up the bass a dB or two to enhance its presence, and EQ down the mids and treble presentation by a similar margin to restrict their forward character. But after some time, I have come to appreciate this IEM without EQ as well. Furthermore, today I find that I generally do not need or require equalization for portable carry, and due to the sonic capabilities of this IEM in combination with its small size, general comfort, and seeming ruggedness, the S.S.R has become yet another go-to for portable everyday carry for me at this point. Whether you prefer to EQ it or not will ultimately be up to you, but it does stand up to equalization quite well nevertheless. For example, I found the S.S.R to be a good fit for the Centron Stack Portable, which has both a treble and bass boost switch, each of which altered the sound of the IEM in pleasurable ways. Overall, the S.S.R is a small, neutral, but mid-elevated set with a relaxed but detailed bass, accurate timbre, and forward vocals, which in the end come across rather enjoyably flat to the listener. In other words, it is a diffuse field tuning with aspects of warmth, whose tonality generally keeps it in line. For $40, these are imaging and staging monsters with sufficient resolution and a moderately expansive soundstage. Like the OG spaceships, their tuning is inconsistent with what most companies are putting out on the market these days, but their sonic textures are referenced, and Moondrop has produced an instant classic, at least from this reviewer's point of view. While these IEMs are one of my favorites under $50 right now, I can also understand that their neutral, reference-like character may be considered by some as less hi-fi in comparison to something like the T2 Plus from 10 Hi-Fi. Therefore, I suspect that the majority of people will most likely prefer that IEM if given the chance to pick between the two. Nevertheless, I look forward to the SSP, the follow-up to the S.S.R, and what Moondrop can do with that IEM as well. If the S.S.R is any indication of what is possible, then that could be a special one, as it might be tuned in a manner which is more towards mass market expectations rather than my own. And just a reminder guys, at the 1,000 subscriber mark I'll be giving away another set of KOS KSC 75s, so make sure to hit subscribe, like the video, tap that notification bell, leave some comments, and follow the neighborhood at all its access locations, including Instagram, the blog, Twitter, and the Patreon. The Patreon is only $1.50 a month, and it will get you early access to written blog reviews. And with that, I'm out for now.